What happens when two strong-willed women with completely different political perspectives find themselves locked in a battle of words that spirals completely out of control? Today we're diving into one of the most explosive moments ever captured on The View, where Whoopi Goldberg absolutely demolished Alyssa Farah Griffin in a heated exchange that left the entire studio speechless. This wasn't your typical political disagreement. This was a full-blown verbal warfare that exposed deep tensions simmering beneath the surface. The gloves came off, voices were raised, and what started as a simple discussion about recent political developments quickly turned into a personal attack that nobody saw coming. If you want to see exactly how this explosive confrontation unfolded word by word, make sure to hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because this story will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about behind-the-scenes tensions at America's most controversial talk show. The tension in Studio 1A was already thick when the cameras started rolling that Tuesday morning. Whoopi Goldberg sat at her usual spot at the head of the Hot Topics table, her expression more serious than usual as she shuffled through her notes. Alyssa Farah Griffin, seated to her right, seemed unusually fidgety, constantly adjusting her blazer and checking her phone despite the no phones during taping rule that everyone knew by heart. "Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to The View," Whoopi began, her voice carrying that familiar authoritative tone that had commanded respect for decades. "We've got a lot to talk about today, and I'm sure our audience is ready for some real conversation about what's happening in our country right now." The other co-hosts nodded along, but there was something different in the air. Sarah N. kept glancing between Whoopi and Alyssa, while Joy Behar seemed more alert than usual, as if she could sense the storm brewing. "Now, we've been talking all week about the recent developments in Washington," Whoopi continued, "and I think it's time we address some of the claims that have been floating around about accountability and leadership. Alyssa, you've been pretty vocal on social media about this topic." Alyssa straightened in her chair, a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Well, Whoopi, I think what we're seeing is exactly what the American people voted for. Sometimes, real leadership means making tough decisions that not everyone is going to like." The words hung in the air for a moment before Whoopi's eyebrows shot up. "Real leadership. Are we talking about the same situation here? Because what I'm seeing looks more like chaos disguised as policy." "I think that's a pretty unfair characterization," Alyssa shot back, her voice gaining confidence. "Just because something challenges the status quo doesn't mean it's chaos. Sometimes change is uncomfortable, but that doesn't make it wrong." Whoopi leaned forward slightly, her famous stare beginning to intensify. "Uncomfortable, Alyssa? We're not talking about rearranging furniture here. We're talking about real consequences for real people. And I think that's exactly why we need leaders who aren't afraid to make the hard choices." Alyssa replied, her tone becoming more defensive. "Look, I know this isn't popular with everyone at this table, but sometimes you have to prioritize long-term benefits over short-term comfort." The studio audience began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. This wasn't the usual back and forth they were accustomed to. There was an edge to both women's voices that suggested this conversation was about to go somewhere unexpected. "Long-term benefits." Whoopi's voice rose slightly. "For who exactly? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like these benefits are pretty selective about who gets to enjoy them." Alyssa's jaw tightened. "That's not fair. Whoopi, you're painting this with a pretty broad brush without looking at the actual details of what's being proposed." "Oh, I've looked at the details," Whoopi said, her voice dripping with barely contained frustration. "And what I see is a whole lot of talk about helping people while the actual policies do the exact opposite." "That's your interpretation," Alyssa fired back. "But I think if you really examined the data objectively, you might come to a different conclusion." The word objectively seemed to flip a switch in Whoopi. Her entire posture changed, and she turned to face Alyssa directly. "Objectively? Are you suggesting that I'm not being objective here?" "I'm saying that maybe we should look at facts instead of feelings," Alyssa replied, apparently not realizing she had just lit a fuse that was about to detonate. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the camera operators seemed to hold their breath as Whoopi processed what had just been said to her. Sarah N. looked like she wanted to disappear into her chair, while Joy Behar's eyes widened in anticipation of what was coming next. "Facts instead of feelings," Whoopi repeated slowly, her voice dangerously quiet. "That's interesting coming from someone who spent the last 4 years defending decisions based on nothing but ego and spite." Alyssa's face flushed red. "That's completely out of line. Whoopi, I've always based my positions on policy analysis and constitutional principles." "Constitutional principles?" Whoopi's voice began to rise again. "Don't lecture me about constitutional principles when you spent years making excuses for behavior. That spat in the face of everything this country is supposed to stand for." "I never made excuses," Alyssa protested. "I provided context and analysis based on my experience in government." "Your experience?" Whoopi was fully animated now, her hands gesturing emphatically. "Your experience watching democracy get trampled." While you wrote press releases trying to make it sound reasonable, the tension in the studio was now so thick you could cut it with a knife. Production assistants were frantically gesturing from behind the cameras, but there was no stopping what was happening. This train had left the station and was picking up speed with every exchange. "I think you're being incredibly unfair," Alyssa said, her voice shaking with emotion. "I worked hard to serve my country and to provide accurate information to the American people." Accurate information? Whoopi's voice cracked with incredulity. "Is that what we're calling it now? Because I remember a whole lot of tap dancing around the truth while real people suffered the consequences." The audience was completely silent now, hanging on every word as these two powerful women faced off in what was quickly becoming the most explosive moment in The View's recent history. Neither seemed willing to back down, and the conversation was spiraling into territory that would have lasting consequences for both of them. Alyssa took a deep breath, clearly trying to regain her composure, but the damage was already done. The gloves were off, and Whoopi was just getting started. "You know what, Alyssa?" Whoopi continued, her voice gaining momentum like a freight train. "I've been doing this job for a long time, and I've sat across from politicians, celebrities, and everyone in between. But what I can't stand, what really gets under my skin, is when someone sits at this table and tries to rewrite history like we're all supposed to have amnesia." "I'm not rewriting anything," Alyssa insisted, but her voice lacked the confidence it had just moments before. "I'm trying to have an honest conversation about complex issues." Honest? Whoopi let out a laugh that had zero humor in it. "You want to talk about honest? Let's be honest about what your version of providing context actually looked like, because from where the rest of us were sitting, it looked like watching someone try to put perfume on a garbage fire." The other co-hosts were now completely frozen in their seats. This had gone far beyond typical political disagreement territory. Sarah N. was staring at her hands, while Joy Behar looked like she was watching a car accident in slow motion. "That's completely unfair," Alyssa shot back, finding some of her fire again. "I worked in an incredibly difficult environment, trying to communicate policy decisions to the American people while dealing with unprecedented circumstances." Unprecedented circumstances. Whoopi's voice rose to a level that made everyone in the studio sit up straighter. "You mean like having to explain why lying to the American people was somehow acceptable? Or having to find creative ways to justify behavior that would get any normal person fired from their job?" "I never justified lying," Alyssa protested. But Whoopi was on a roll now, and there was no stopping her. "Oh, you didn't justify it. You just found really creative ways to avoid calling it what it was," Whoopi fired back. "You turned it into alternative facts, and different perspectives, and misunderstandings, instead of just admitting that sometimes people in power lie. And it's wrong, period." Alyssa's face was now completely red, whether from embarrassment or anger. It was impossible to tell. "You're oversimplifying an incredibly complex situation. Governance isn't black and white, Whoopi. Sometimes there are competing priorities and difficult choices that have to be made." Competing priorities. Whoopi was now fully animated, her hands moving as she spoke. "What competing priority makes it okay to undermine democratic institutions? What difficult choice justifies attacking the free press? Help me understand the complexity there, because I must be too simple to figure it out." The sarcasm in Whoopi's voice was so thick you could practically see it hanging in the air. The studio audience was completely silent, afraid that even the slightest sound might break the spell of this incredible confrontation. "I think you're mischaracterizing my record," Alyssa said, but her voice was getting smaller with each exchange. "I always tried to provide accurate information within the constraints of my position." "Constraints of your position," Whoopi repeated, her voice dripping with disbelief. "What constraints?" "The constraint of having to pretend that chaos was actually strategy. The constraint of having to make incompetence sound presidential." "That's not fair," Alyssa whispered, but Whoopi was just hitting her stride. "You know what's not fair, Alyssa? What's not fair is sitting here today, at this table, trying to rehabilitate decisions that caused real harm to real people. What's not fair is expecting us to forget what we all witnessed with our own eyes because you've decided to rebrand yourself as some kind of reasonable voice." The words hit Alyssa like physical blows. She looked around the table desperately, as if hoping one of the other co-hosts might throw her a lifeline, but they were all too stunned to intervene. "I've never tried to rebrand myself," Alyssa managed to say. "I've been consistent in my principles throughout my career." "Consistent?" Whoopi let out another one of those humorless laughs. "The only thing you've been consistent about is finding ways to make unacceptable behavior sound acceptable. That's not principles, that's public relations." The silence that followed was so complete that you could hear the hum of the studio lights. Alyssa looked like she had been slapped, while Whoopi sat back in her chair, clearly not finished, but taking a moment to let her words sink in. "I think we should move on to our next topic," Sarah N. finally whispered. But Whoopi held up her hand. "No, we're not moving on," Whoopi said firmly, "because this is exactly the problem. We have these conversations, things get uncomfortable. and then we just move on like nothing happened. Well, I'm not moving on. Not today. Alyssa straightened up in her chair, apparently deciding that if she was going down swinging. Fine, Whoopi, you want to have this conversation, let's have it. But let's be honest about what this is really about. Oh please, enlighten me, Whoopi said, her voice dripping with mock anticipation. Tell me what this is really about. This is about the fact that you can't stand that someone at this table doesn't automatically agree with your political worldview. Alyssa said, her voice gaining strength. This is about the fact that you want everyone to think exactly like you do, and when they don't, you attack them personally instead of engaging with their ideas. The studio went dead silent. Even the camera operators stopped moving. Alyssa had just accused Whoopi Goldberg, in front of a live studio audience and millions of viewers, of being close-minded and personally vindictive. The fallout from those words was going to be immediate and severe. Whoopi's face went through a series of expressions in rapid succession. First surprise, then anger, then something that looked almost like hurt before settling into a cold fury. That was somehow more terrifying than her earlier outbursts. You think this is about politics? Whoopi asked, her voice dangerously quiet again. You think I'm attacking you because we disagree about policy. I think you're attacking me because I don't fit into your neat little box of what someone with my background is supposed to believe, Alyssa replied, apparently committed to this course of action regardless of the consequences. My neat little box, Whoopi repeated slowly. Alyssa, let me tell you something about boxers. I've been fighting my way out of other people's boxers my entire life. So don't you dare sit there and try to turn this around like I'm the one who can't handle different perspectives. Then what is this about? Alyssa demanded, because it feels pretty personal to me. The question hung in the air like smoke after an explosion. Everyone in the studio held their breath, waiting to see how Whoopi would respond to this direct challenge. The next few moments would determine whether this confrontation would end with some kind of resolution or complete nuclear destruction. Whoopi stared at Alyssa for what felt like an eternity, her eyes narrowing as she processed the challenge that had just been thrown down. When she finally spoke, her voice was so controlled it was almost whisper quiet, but every word carried the weight of a sledgehammer. What this is about, Alyssa, is integrity. What this is about is the difference between having principles and having talking points. What this is about is the fact that you sat in rooms where decisions were made that hurt people, and instead of speaking up, you found ways to make those decisions sound reasonable to the public. Alyssa opened her mouth to respond, but Whoopi held up her hand and continued. And now you want to sit at this table, with me, and pretend like we're just having a casual political disagreement. Like your role in normalizing behavior that undermined our democracy is just a difference of opinion that we can agree to disagree about. I never normalized anything, Alyssa protested, but her voice was shaking now. I did my job with integrity and professionalism. Integrity. Whoopi's voice began to rise again, but this time there was something deeper than anger in it. There was disappointment, and that somehow made it worse. You want to talk about integrity? Let me tell you what integrity looks like. Integrity is speaking truth to power even when it costs you something. Integrity is admitting when you're wrong instead of doubling down on being wrong. Integrity is not sitting here today trying to convince us that your complicity was actually courage. The words hit the studio like a physical force. Alyssa looked like she had been punched in the stomach, while the other co-hosts seemed to shrink further into their chairs with each devastating sentence. I was never complicit, Alyssa said weakly, but even she seemed to know how hollow the words sounded. You were the voice that made unacceptable things sound acceptable, Whoopi continued, her voice gaining power. You were the person who stood behind that podium and asked the American people to believe that what they were seeing with their own eyes wasn't really happening. That's not public service, Alyssa, that's manipulation. I provided factual information based on policy decisions that were made above my pay grade, Alyssa shot back, finding some fight left in her. I didn't make the policies, I communicated them. And how did you communicate them? Whoopi demanded. With honesty, with transparency, or with carefully crafted language designed to hide the real impact of what was happening. Alyssa felt silent, and in that silence, Whoopi delivered what would become the most talked about moment of the entire confrontation. You know what the real tragedy is here, Alyssa? The tragedy is that you had a platform, you had influence, you had the ear of people in power, and you chose to use all of that to protect the powerful instead of the powerless. You chose to be a shield for bad decisions instead of a voice for the people who were getting hurt by those decisions. The studio was so quiet you could hear people breathing. Alyssa's eyes were now filled with tears. But Whoopi wasn't finished. And the most insulting part of all of this is that you seem to think that your intentions matter more than the impact of your actions. You seem to think that because you believed you were doing the right thing, we should all just forget about the actual consequences of what you did. That's not true, Alyssa whispered, but there was no conviction left in her voice. It is true, Whoopi said firmly, and sitting here today, trying to rehabilitate your image by positioning yourself as some kind of reasonable, moderate voice. while never actually acknowledging the harm that your reasonableness enabled. That's not growth, Alyssa. That's just more of the same public relations strategy that got us here in the first place. Joy Behar finally found her voice. Maybe we should take a break, she suggested quietly, but Whoopi shook her head. No, we're not taking a break. Because this is important. This is about accountability, and we don't get to just take a break from accountability when it gets uncomfortable. Alyssa wiped her eyes and took a shaky breath. You know what, Whoopi, you're right about one thing. This is about accountability. And maybe it's time you held yourself accountable for the way you treat people who don't agree with you. The words were barely out of her mouth before Whoopi responded with devastating clarity. I hold myself accountable every single day. I hold myself accountable for the words I say, the positions I take, and the impact I have on the people who watch this show. But what I will not do is hold myself accountable for refusing to pretend that your record is something other than what it is. What I will not do is apologize for expecting better from people who had the privilege of serving in government. Privilege. Alyssa's voice cracked with emotion. You think it was a privilege to work in that environment? You think it was easy? I think it was a choice, Whoopi replied without hesitation. Every single day, you chose to stay. Every single day, you chose to be the voice that made the unacceptable sound acceptable. Every single day, you chose your career over your conscience. And those were your choices to make. But don't sit here now and ask me to pretend they were noble. The silence that followed was deafening. Alyssa sat motionless, tears streaming down her face as the full weight of Whoopi's words settled over the studio. The other co-hosts looked like they wished they could disappear entirely, while the audience sat in stunned silence, processing what they had just witnessed. Finally, Alyssa stood up from her chair, her hands shaking as she removed her microphone. I can't do this anymore, she said quietly. I came here to have honest conversations about important issues, not to be personally attacked and humiliated. Nobody attacked you, Alyssa, Whoopi said, her voice now calm but still firm. I told you the truth about your record. If that feels like an attack, maybe you should ask yourself why. Alyssa looked around the table one more time, as if hoping someone would come to her defense, but the other co-hosts remained silent. Without another word, she walked off the set, leaving behind one of the most explosive moments in The View's history. Whoopi watched her go, then turned back to the camera with the composure of someone who had said exactly what she meant to say. We'll be right back, she said simply, and the show cut to commercial break. When they returned, Alyssa's chair sat empty for the remainder of the show, a silent testament to a confrontation that would be talked about for years to come. What you just witnessed was more than just a disagreement between co-hosts. It was a reckoning, a moment when years of frustration and disappointment boiled over into one of the most brutally honest exchanges ever captured on television. Make sure you subscribe for more stories like this one, and drop a comment below telling us what you think. Was Whoopi justified in her approach, or did she go too far in this explosive confrontation?